Viewer discretion is strongly advised as the content of this narration may be disturbing. I always wanted a family and a home. I was in love with a good man, and he was as ready to marry and have kids as I was. As usual, life showed up and wrecked it all. I was on my way to an 8 o'clock microbiology class one morning, and a drunk frat boy ran a red light and plowed into my car, top speed. The two legs that my boyfriend loved to touch were both broken in multiple places, and the ovaries that were supposed to help me produce those children I was dying to have were both severely damaged, along with the rest of my internal organs. So, during the semester that I was supposed to finish up junior year as a pre-med student, I was forced to withdraw from my classes and watch the world from my comfortable traction frame in the hospital. The doctors who operated on me had been kind enough not to go for the full hysterectomy on the day I was hurt, but when I came to, I was very delicately told that the odds were not good. My boyfriend stayed right there with me, and he was holding me when I took my second first steps. That was nice, but the "there's still a chance" thing evaporated when the ovarian cysts and the scar tissue forced me to agree to a hysterectomy at the ripe old age of 23. That was about the time that my boyfriend started to become distant, and then I didn't have him anymore. I won't lie, I was fairly suicidal then. Without him, and without hope for children, I really didn't see that I had that many reasons to live. I was so in love with kids and family that I had been determined since high school to be an obstetrician or a gynecologist. After a year of coming back from the crash, I was extremely behind and my entire peer group had moved on by 2 semesters, so there went my great college experience. I also couldn't bear the thought of being around pregnant women and infants. Maybe that's cold, but the pain was incredible, and it still is. I couldn't just keep spiraling, so when I could drive and get around again, I made an appointment with my advisor to try and sort out what to do with my life post-accident. She listened to my story, and then she gave me a life-changing piece of advice. If the pain of losing out on having children was too much to let me bring them into the world, maybe I should consider helping those who'd had the same pain. She pointed out that I had enough psych hours to put me 3 semesters from a degree in psychology. That would allow me to pursue a master's degree in counseling, and then I could work in mental health. That was at least a glimmer of hope, especially from where I was sitting, so I took the opportunity. I started taking classes again, and I even met the woman who is my best friend today. Danielle and I became friends in our early childhood development class the first semester I was back, and we shared a schedule and an apartment all the way through grad school. When we were done, we even got jobs at the same school. She was a social studies teacher, and I was the school's guidance counselor. Life was good then. I'd built a career, I had close friends, and I was seeing a guy that I really liked. I still wasn't over my last boyfriend. And I'm still really not. And I don't believe that a woman ever gets over being unable to ever have kids. But my life as a counselor, and a woman with good friends was a hell of a lot more appealing than the life I had led confined to that bed with pins in my legs. I was a little itchy to stretch my horizons, and Danielle had said multiple times that we ought to have a private practice together. I didn't think much of it, but then one day at a staff lunch I mentioned the idea to the vice principal. She loved the idea, and she encouraged me to look into it. Thus encouraged, I started researching ways to establish a private office. The prospects didn't look great, but then the VP told me that she'd spoken to her husband, a surgeon in the Air Force, and that he'd said that the military contractor that coordinated healthcare for the base he worked on was letting contracts for someone specializing in family and early childhood therapy. I figured it for a long shot, but I took the number she gave me and called them. For the first time in a while, an unexpected good thing happened, and shortly Danny and I had a private office with a steady flow of clients. I really do care about people and mental health, but I can't help but say that for the first time since I'd given up medical school, the prospect of an above-teacher paycheck was pretty sweet. It also, more importantly, would give me more of a chance to help my patients in the long term instead of a 30-minute session during school lunches with kids I didn't really know. We rented a small office, hired a secretary, and suddenly I was a woman with a boyfriend, good friends, and a business. The clientele took some getting used to. This was around 2010, and the vast majority of my referrals were for women and kids who'd lost husbands and fathers in the Middle East. I worked hard to help them, but there is only so much you can do in those situations even as a therapist. I spent more than a few hours crying with widowed moms, and more holding their crying children. One day I was going over the new referrals for week, and I noticed that I was scheduled for a first appointment with a boy named Jacob. The referral sheet listed the reason for the consult as depressed behavior difficulty following father's death. That was by no means unusual. So at 1 o'clock I walked into my office to find a perfectly normal-looking 8-year-old sitting on the couch beside his mother. I introduced myself, and Jacob and his mother were more than cordial. We talked for a while, and other than being quiet, Jacob wasn't at all unusual. After a while, I asked Jacob if he would mind me talking to his mother alone for a little while. He went into the waiting area, and I asked his mother to give me a description of his symptoms. She suddenly got very somber, not like she had been just before. I asked her to describe his symptoms to me, and she said that he'd been asking questions about his father's death. It's perfectly normal for a child to have questions when one of their parents has passed away, and it's also normal for a grieving widow to have great difficulty talking about it. I pointed these things out to her, I thought pretty gently. She said, "You don't understand? He's not asking me about his father's service, or what kind of person he was, or whether the two of them ever spent any time together when Jake was a baby. He wants to know." Her voice trailed off. After a few seconds I asked, "What kind of questions has he been asking then?" The other night, I was in the living room alone. I thought Jake was in bed, but he came down and sat on the couch with me. I asked if he'd had a bad dream or if he was hungry or something. She looked very disturbed. He asked me did they bring home Dad's legs. I asked if her husband had lost his legs. She nodded. Yes. But Jake didn't know that. My husband died in an IED blast. His legs were severed, but the casket they brought him back in was never opened. They told me what happened, obviously, but I would never have told my boy that. Jake doesn't know that, or at least he shouldn't. I have to say that, as a therapist, you sometimes have to take a pragmatic view of things in spite of your own feelings. My first thought as a clinician was that this kid may be asking uncomfortable questions as a way to trigger upset in his mother. Again, it's cold, but when a person feels uncomfortable expressing upset, they might say or do things to evoke those feelings in others as a way to mask their own grief. It's common, but uncommonly so among young boys with anxiety and depression. I talked to Mrs. Rittermeyer for a little while longer, and she gave me some more information. She said that Jake had also talked about wanting to talk to the men who'd served with his father, and that he'd been claiming to have vivid conversations with his father in his dreams. There was definitely something going on with him, and it wasn't something that would be pleasant to confront, but it also wasn't something I hadn't dealt with beforehand. We finished up, and when they left I really thought that I'd had a normal first consult with a normal patient. The next Monday, Jacob showed up for his appointment accompanied by his father's mother. She said that Jacob's mom was a nurse and worked during the day, so he'd be riding with her most counseling days. Jacob and I went to the office, and this is where it gets weird. I asked Jake to tell me how he felt about his dad. Just in general. I haven't met him yet. He can only talk to me when I'm asleep, and his body's gone. His demeanor was changing, and he wasn't like he'd been in the first meeting. I told him that I knew what he'd asked about his dad's legs, and I asked if his dad had told him about that. He said that he had. I honestly didn't think that I was dealing with anything except a hurting little boy who was manifesting symptoms of anxiety, so I went ahead with the textbook play, gently call out the bullshit. I said, "Does your dad ask you to ask your mom these questions?" He said, "No, not really. He tells me things, but he mostly talks in pictures. If I don't get it all when he shows me, I ask my mom what it means." I asked, "What does he show you?" He said, "He showed me how he died, some things he did with his friends. He sometimes shows me how things were before I was born." Up to this point, he hadn't said anything I didn't expect. I was trying to break through the walls he had up, so I amped up the probing. I asked, "So, your dad's in heaven now? Has he showed you heaven?" He just kept staring at the floor. "No, it's not heaven. It's not like that. There are a lot of people in there." I could tell that this was going to be a rough process, and I didn't see any good in trying a "damn it, kid, we both know you're lying" approach. Highly unprofessional and almost always unproductive. We talked for about 30 minutes, and I asked his grandmother if she would speak to me in private. She came in and sat down, and I played a hunch. I was sure that Jacob was acting out of his own accord, but there was still the question of how he was getting this information that he was asking about. Doing some simple math, I figured that if his mother wasn't lying, and I had no reason to think that she was, he might be getting it from his grandmother. After all, a mother-in-law and a daughter-in-law, both reeling from the loss of the same man. One could see where there might be some conflict. I asked her, "Does Jake ever talk to you about Luke?" She thought about it for a second, then she said, "Not really. Not as much as I would like. I wish he would let it out, but he's really quiet when we're together." "Well, damn. Does he interact with your husband at all?" "No. This is my second marriage. My husband isn't his grandfather. Rick works offshore anyway, so he's not around Jake much." That took me nowhere fast, so I wound up the conversation and Renee, his grandmother, took Jake and left. I was at a loss. What I was seeing with Jacob wasn't exactly new, but there was the lingering question of how he might have found out about these things. His mother had told me about the legs thing, and that he often spoke about his father's platoon mates, as if he knew them. My working theory was that he was already acting out because of grief, but that there was some outside actor who was indulging this by telling him these stories. It wouldn't do me much good to confront the misbehavior without taking care of whoever was subsidizing it. I decided that I would have to call the bluff, but in a subtle way. Monica, Jacob's mother, had said that Luke's friends from the army only met Jacob at the funeral, and he had been 3 years old. They lived all over the country, and Jake really had no way of covertly contacting them. I called Monica over the weekend, and by a stroke of luck Jake was out of the house. I told her what I was thinking, and she was willing to help me work through this. I know it's not easy to doubt or confront your own child, but to her credit she was determined to help Jacob. I also think she was increasingly uncomfortable with the questions he was asking, and she was willing to risk upsetting him if it stopped the morose conversations. After all, she did lose her husband too. I asked her if she had any way of contacting anyone from Luke's unit, and she said that she could contact them via social media if she needed to. I asked her to put me in touch with one of them if they were willing, and she said she'd try. It took 2 weeks, but she finally called me one afternoon and said that she had told Luke's platoon leader, Lieutenant Francis Versano, about what was happening in Jake's therapy and that he'd help me. I had a video conference with him, and I told him what I wanted to do. If Jake's story was that he was talking to his dad and that he knew all about his war experiences, what would be the harm in having him talk to an old army buddy? I felt that if Jacob was shown someone who'd actually served with his father, he might realize that the proverbial jig was up and we might reach a turning point. We decided to have a video conference on the day of Jake's next therapy session. I'd bring Jake in, the computer would be on the table in front of us, and Versano would greet him and start up a conversation. I really thought I'd nailed it down, and on Monday I brought Jacob in for his session as if nothing was out of the ordinary. He sat down at the table, and I said, "Jake, I've got a surprise today. Someone who knew your dad well is with us, and he's gonna talk to us today." I flicked my laptop out of sleep mode, and there was Versano. I started to ask Jacob if he knew who he was looking at, but before Versano or I could say anything, Jacob looked calmly at the screen and said, "Oh, Frank." I froze. Versano kept his composure though. "Hey there, buddy. What's going on today?" I don't know how to explain this, but Jacob's face changed. I've said that he was normally quiet and withdrawn, but now he suddenly had a smile on his face, an adult smile. His eyes weren't wide and clear like a child. They were eyes full of age and contemplation, and there was immediately a strange air in the room with us. "Frank, I've been trying to find you. I have something to tell you." I'd prepped Versano and I'd told him about the questions Jake was asking, and the dream talks. I have to say, he played it cool at first. That's what Mrs. Teresa told me. She says you want to know some things about your dad. "You know, Jake, I was with your dad. He knows you tried, Frank." I looked at Versano out of the corner of my eyes. I was sitting on the couch by Jacob with the computer in front of us, and I didn't want to look as panicked as I was. I'm telling you, you could actually see the color draining out of this man's face. "What?" he asked in a thin voice. Jacob was still smiling, his voice remaining calm and cool. "He saw you. You tried to find him. To help him." Versano cleared his throat. He tried to regain his composure. "Jake, I don't know who you've talked to about how your dad passed away, but He told me, Frankie. He showed me. That scatterbomb trashed the Humvee, and you ended up in the ditch. Your leg was busted up real bad. My eyes fell from the screen. It was all I could do not to run from this child, and I couldn't have stayed there if I had looked at either one of them. Versano's expression and his voice told me that, somehow, this boy wasn't kidding. He knew these things. You were trying to find him. He was dead when the bomb went off. Gone below his belt line. You couldn't reach him in the smoke and the blood, but you dragged yourself from the ditch to the middle of the wreck, ducked the flames. He saw you coming, and he was so proud to have a friend like you. He knows you tried, Frank, and he still loves you. I still couldn't look up, but I heard the choking and blubbering sounds from Versano's webcam and then the silence when he shut off the feed. I didn't think I could be that afraid of a child, but I was shaking. Kevin turned around to look at me, serene as you could imagine. Thank you for letting me see him. I asked Mom about it, but she didn't want to. It really helped. I told Jake to go back to his grandmother. That we were done for the day. I honestly just wanted him to be gone. I told the secretary to cancel my appointments, and I went straight home. I locked the doors and hid myself in my own bedroom like I was waiting for my 8-year-old patient to roll up in my driveway and murder me. I had to sit and think for a while to calm myself down. But then I realized that I was dealing with a patient who obviously was in some kind of trouble. Yes, it was disturbing, but this was obviously more of a problem than I had been banking on. His grandmother had said that he wouldn't talk to her. Jake's mother had verified the story about Renee's husband working offshore, so that negated him. Versano's reaction had quashed the hope that Jacob was making all of these things he claimed to know. The only suspect I could see, with all of my therapist's instincts, was Renee. She had been perfectly civil every time we met, and she was very attentive to Jacob. There was no evidence that she might be feeding into Jake's behavior, but she was the only one in his life who might know anything about Luke's death. It hardly made sense that his mother would pump him up with a bunch of morose details about his dad's death, and then sign her own kid up for therapy. I had to talk to her alone, so I decided to call her in the morning and request that she come to my office later in the week. She showed up that Wednesday with Jacob in tow. She left him in the waiting room and came back to my office, looking a little perturbed. Renee, I've run into a problem with Jake's therapy. I think you might be able to help me. Sure, she said. I swirled several sentences around in my head looking for one that didn't sound accusatory, but it turned out that there wasn't one. Renee, has Monica told you her reasons for bringing Jacob to me? She shook her head. No. Only that she thought he was having trouble, and she wanted to head it off. She told me about the dreams. She said he was asking about Luke, but I didn't think that was unusual. Then Jake hasn't asked you anything about Luke? No. I told you before that he hadn't. Yes, you did, but Renee? Jacob has been asking his mother questions about his father that a child his age wouldn't come up with on his own, and what is it exactly that you think I might have told him? She snapped. Well, there went the gentle approach. He knows how his father died. Renee nodded in a sarcastic way. Yes, he knows his father died in war. His father was a soldier. He didn't need his grandmother to tell him that. No. I mean, he knows exactly how his father died. He told Frank Versano how it happened. Frank Versano? You've spoken to Frank? Yes, Jake and I. I wanted Versano to. You shouldn't have subjected him to that. He's a child. She was yelling so loud that my ears rang. She was ranting about Jacob's being a child and my incompetence. Finally, when I thought that she'd let out enough steam to speak, I interrupted her. Renee, I have a responsibility to your grandson and your family. LCT didn't give me this position for me to give half-assed solutions to Jake. What? You work for LCT? Her voice had changed now. She wasn't angry anymore. The look and tone of rage was replaced with bewilderment and a swelling fear. Yes. Why? Jake. Jake, come in here. Jacob opened the office door and looked in, moving his eyes from me to his grandmother. Jake, come here. Jake walked over to the sofa and stood in front of Renee. She reached out and clutched his shoulders, looking into his eyes as if she was looking past them and hunting for what ailed him in the back spaces of his little head. Jake, your dad? You talked to him, really? Yes. At night, he said flatly, his grandmother's agitation seeming not to faze him. Jake, where is he? Did you see him, in heaven? A happy place, Jake? Renee was beginning to break down. I was so confused. She had been perfectly fine, if irate, just a few seconds before. Now, her chin was furrowed and quivering as violently as her hands. Her chest and stomach were heaving as her breath came in pants. No. He's in a cage. That thing in the back of his head took him there. Renee's sniffling turned into a wail. It was a guttural sound, like a wounded animal that had no more strength to fight. She stood up suddenly, grabbing Jacob's arm. Renee, let's just talk about this. Please. Please don't leave, let's just. The banging of the door as Renee flung it open shook the windows. She wasn't hearing me at all. She was pulling at Jacob so hard that his feet were barely touching the ground as she dragged him out of the office's front door. I ran after them, flanked by Misty, my secretary. I was sprinting just to catch up to Renee, and when I reached the front door, Renee was already stuffing Jacob into the passenger seat of her car. I ran to her as she made for the driver's side door. Renee, this isn't healthy for him. Please, whatever you're feeling. I felt my front teeth plunge into my lips as her fist collided with my mouth. I felt the shrubs of the front flower bed scratching and stabbing my back and arms. But my vision was too blurry for me to see Misty's face as she tried to tug me out of the bushes. I heard tires screeching out of our parking lot. Misty managed to get me back to my office. My watering eyes did me a favor by not letting me see the faces of the patients who'd been sitting in the waiting area. I was in shock. Misty got me an ice pack and sent the clients home. I must have sat in my chair for an hour before I got my senses back, and I still had to be driven home. I didn't leave my house for the rest of the week. It wasn't that she'd hit me. That was just the straw that broke the camel's back. The darkness that had been hanging around me since my first session with Jake finally broke through, and even in silence I could still hear him saying that his dead father was in a cage. Danielle visited me over the weekend, and that brought me back to myself somewhat. What are you gonna do? Please tell me you aren't gonna let this be the end of our practice. I don't know if we have a choice, Danny. I don't know what I did or said, but I have a feeling that she's already talking to LCT. How come? She knows them. She seemed to, at least. That's what set her off. You want me to call the liaison and poke around? If she's filed a complaint with them, Stephanie would tell me. No. I don't want to make it worse. They'll call me, I'm sure. But there was no call. I saw all the rest of my regular clients that week, and there was no mention of LCT or Jacob. Monica had canceled his regular Monday appointment the previous Friday when I was off, and she didn't call back to reschedule. I waited every minute for my phone to ring. I kept rehearsing my response to the "we've been told" in light of these events. Conversation that I was certain was forthcoming, but the call didn't come. I came back Monday rested and somewhat more relaxed. I put Jacob and his family out of my mind as best as I could. I love my work, and I believe that I bring light and healing to my patients, but whatever was troubling Jake was beyond me. I satisfied myself by imagining that his grandmother's outburst signified her reaching a cathartic moment. That she'd taken Jake to Monica and that the three of them had had a long-needed conversation about Luke and their own feelings. I hoped that the problem, whatever it was, had been flushed into the open and that Jake and Monica and Renee were living their lives in a better state of mind. That was just starting to make me comfortable in my practice and in my own skin. The following Monday, bright and early in the morning, that newfound peace was shot straight to hell when I walked in and found Monica sitting in my waiting room, Jake sitting next to her, and both of them looking at me as I walked through the door. "Mrs. Fuller, good morning. I hope you don't mind us stopping by." My guts were in my throat. "No, sure. Need something?" I stammered. "Well, I kinda want to talk to you. You know, about Renee and all." I just pointed to my office. Monica told Jake to wait for us. I didn't even look at him, grateful not to have to be caged in the same small room with him again. I'd had quite enough of that already. When we were inside, Monica sat down on the couch opposite to me, looking quite calm. "My mother-in-law wants me to tell you, first of all, that she's extremely sorry," she said, eyeing my lower face like she was imagining the now-gone bruises. I gave a nod. She was very stressed. I didn't enjoy being punched, but she's lost her only child. I'd probably want to hit someone too. She's ashamed about that. It's not her way, please believe me. It's okay. I'm a big girl, and it wasn't entirely unexpected. Monica nodded, turning her eyes away from me. "I hope you'll consider keeping Jake as a patient. He's getting better with you, and I think he needs you." I know I looked at her like a lunatic, but I couldn't help it. After what we'd just finished discussing, how could she think Jacob had gotten any better? Better, Mrs. Rittermeyer? I have to say, as his therapist, I haven't seen it. Well, he wasn't. I really didn't think his therapy was helping. Until last week, I really didn't see any difference. But after Renee brought him home, he was a different person. Then, Renee didn't report me? Oh no. Nothing like that. She told me about what she'd said to you. It wasn't even about you, it's just that she used to work for the same company. She didn't part with them on happy terms. Renee is a therapist? No, she's an engineer, computers and stuff. LCT is a big company. They do a lot of different stuff. She worked R&D, but she couldn't talk about it. The government is funny about that kind of stuff. Funnily enough, she called them afterwards and she's going to consult with them. Funny, huh? Something rotten and terrible was swirling around in my stomach, but I couldn't peg it then. I didn't know that. Still, after that last session, I've been waiting for a call from my lawyers. Monica smiled. No, nothing like that. We're very happy that Jake has you. In fact, he asked me if he could see you today when I told him we were coming. I would understand if your answer is no, but I was wondering. She lifted her eyebrows and folded her hands in a hopeful gesture. I was still uneasy, but I was interested to know what had improved so much that he actually wanted to see me. I told her that I could talk with him for a little while, and she sent him in. I was standing when he entered, and I was bracing myself for that maddeningly blank look that I'd gotten used to seeing when he came for a session. But then there was suddenly a little head against my thigh and a pair of little arms wrapped around both of my legs. Jacob? I asked as I looked down. He was snubbing quietly, with little tears streaming down his face as he looked up. His eyes were big and bright, no longer disturbed and distant the way they'd been since day one. I shouldn't have said anything. They turned it off because I told Grandma. I was sort of swaying back and forth, too stunned to say or do anything sensible. I put my hand slowly on his head, brushing away the hair from his forehead. Jake, who? What did you tell us? The maternal instinct must never die, because I forgot at once about all of the weird things that had come out of Jake's mouth, and I found myself sitting down and pulling him onto my knee, wiping his tears with the back of my hand. I told you about Dad. That I could talk to him. That's what they needed. That rotten thing in my insides was swirling again. My training, my professionalism, and my grand theories left. That's what who needed, Jake? The people who have Dad. They won't let me see him anymore. They won't let him out of the cage. They have what they wanted. What did they want? Grandma. She went back to them. She made the thing in his head, and they put it there. It took him into the cage when he died. They only let me see him so she'd go back, and they turned it off. He can't get out of the cage anymore. I couldn't breathe. I just sat there with Jake crying on my lap. The cage. His grandmother worked with computers. The cage. His dad had something in the back of his head. The cage. When his dad died, the thing took him away. The cage. Renee went back to LCT after Jake said he could speak to his father. The cage. They have what they wanted. The cage.